think I said this before, but I'll say it again. My name is Tedra Kirby. I'm your moderator for today. Guys, before we even get anywhere else in the discussion, let's address the elephant in the room. We are talking about LGBTQ rights in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. It is perhaps one of the most controversial topics locally. Why do we even need to be having this conversation right now, in your opinions? Elisa, let's start with you.
How long do we have to answer? Why should we be doing this? Because it touches on so many things. I think so we had the opportunity to do another event in connection with commemorating Pride here in St. Vincent. Very big deal that we're even doing that. But last week, we had another ERAO-sponsored event discussing sexual orientation and gender identity. And as part of that conversation, we started talking about transgendered folks and talking about, okay, well, why it's so important to talk about them and include them. And I said, well, because it has to do with whatever happens to the most marginalized and most vulnerable people in a given space or country, it says something about what can happen to anyone else. So we have conversations about the rights of LGBTQIA plus persons because it's fundamentally intertwined with our own rights, whether or not some people are cognizant of that or not. And then it ends up touching all sorts of other things, other people's mental health, other people's access to opportunities, right? So that's why we have to do it, because it's wound into our own freedoms.
Guys, I have to ask you, because Marlon and Zita, you guys are also very much included in this conversation. Based on your advocacy, Zita, you are a part of an extremely big case that we're going to touch on later today. But why do the elephant in the room, it's a hot topic in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. It makes a lot of people uncomfortable. And even with talking about this event today, and a lot of the work that Equal Rights, Access and Opportunities, SVG Inc. has done, has gotten a lot of blowback. In your opinions, why is this conversation really needed? Because some people think it's not needed at all, that we're pushing an agenda.
Somebody pushing the agenda. I think Alyssa has covered much of it, fundamentally. We're talking about people who are human beings. And if we start at the point of human dignity or the dignity of man, then we must have this conversation, because there is a group of people who live with us, among us, people who we know, we see grow up together, people who we see are trying to thrive in this society and are marginalized, discriminated against, and ill-treated. And if it's one of those rights that we have, fundamental rights that we have, that is absolute in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, is to have protection from degrading and inhumane treatment. So it's important for us to have this conversation. I don't want to take us to back, but remember about a few years ago, there was an incident in the countryside where a young man was chased, or, and I can't remember if he was beaten, but I think he went through a really rough treatment in the community. And it was said, of course, that, he was passing himself off as a woman, dressed like a woman. And that gave rise for a community to rise up and try to harm this young man. Now, seriously, doesn't tell you about who we are as a community, that even if one tries to express him or herself in a particular way that we don't think or agree with, that it gives us a right to harm that person. Now, I don't believe that that is something that, as you said, I have a son, although he's not here right now, but I don't think that is a community in which I would like my son or his children or little cousins and neighbors to grow up in. We are too punitive, and a lot of it has to do with the Christian background, if I can say that, the religious background in which we live in, and all of us have gone to church and an interpretation of what the Bible says, but most of the time we don't know how to incorporate in our lifestyle that we need to love each other.
That's an interesting take, because for many people who do take a religious stance against this, that's usually something that is left out. That bit about loving each other. You hear many quotes and many verses from the Bible, but never that one when it comes to a conversation about LGBTQI rights. Marlon, what do you think, or why is it so uncomfortable? So Zita and Alisa has talked about why we need to have the conversation. I want to ask you, why is it so uncomfortable for so many Vincentians to have this conversation?
So, a very interesting question. For us to understand the issue, we have to trace ourselves all the way back and where are we coming from. Most of the time we hear the topic of slavery comes up, but most of what we learn today came out of slavery. For example, our religion came out of slavery. Religion was taught as a means of control to our forefathers out of slavery. So in essence, the true religion was never given to them. You're talking about where people are just giving you enough to control you, to ensure that the oppression continue. Also, when we look at our history, sodomizing our men was also an act of control. For example, in St. Vincent in Jamaica, most of our men that rebelled during slavery were brought before a congregation of people and they were sodomized. So when we look at all of that, where people have no total understanding of the Bible, and you talk about the ability to love one another as you love yourself, not really truly understanding, we're talking about where scriptures were isolated. And for example, we have scriptures in Leviticus where it talks about if a man lieth with mankind, he should surely be put to death. But before that, there was a range of sexual immorality that say the same thing, but nobody speaks about them because it benefits them in the end. So when we look at why it's so difficult, is because we are built on a society where true understanding of the principles we hold as moral high ground were never understood.
That's a very powerful response. Honestly, I know when I asked the question, I wasn't sure what to expect, but I don't think I was expecting, especially that last bit. And I'm seeing some of our audience members like, but so we've addressed the elephant in the room. We had a couple elephants. But just to contextualize the conversation today, can you comment on your work so that our viewing audience and our in-studio audience understands exactly how much of an authority you are on this topic?
So before I do that, I just wanted to touch on something, because Marlon, you said something I thought was really important, and I think it might help us ground this conversation, not just for us here, but like for the people watching. We're talking about people really rethinking things that kind of feel like they anchor and underpin their entire existence. And that's scary to talk about. It's scary to acknowledge that there could be something different and something outside of what you fundamentally believe. So just kind of wanting to say to anybody who's watching, and if you're engaging in this conversation, like really just applauding people for being willing to question things that are really fundamental. Like, I get that that's scary. So in terms of giving some context to my work, I am trained as a school psychologist, which means that I went into my work being particularly interested in what goes on with youth and kind of like the intersections between school-aged and education settings and mental health. And so there's what I've chosen to do for a living and what I think of as, and in my case at least, it's vocational. I feel very much called to my work. The advocacy work that I do within LGBTQIA communities comes as a wellspring of that and the intersection of my own identities and kind of, moving and growing and evolving into those things and learning more about LGBTQAI persons, both for understanding my own self and understanding other people, and hopefully being able to be a bridge between the two. Yeah. So basically, as my career has progressed, I've searched for the opportunities to do work with populations that are particularly vulnerable. So women, children, LGBTQAI, and then now that I have a private practice, seeking to educate myself so that I can offer services that are sexual orientation and gender identity affirming, persons who have different styles of commitment in their relationships, kink-friendly, sex-friendly services, because I think those are important.
You have all those services. No, that's a research question for the audience.
As a practitioner, as a psychologist, I strive to be all of those things. There are other associates that work out of the practice, and we respect a range of philosophical positions, belief systems, once they are not promoting discrimination or hate. So, but I can only speak for myself in terms of those services.
Well, we're happy to know that those services exist. So Zito, you might have a bit of a long-winded response to this, because I'm going to have a follow-up question. So once you answer, just expect me to go in on your advocacy.
I am waiting, but I do not have such a long response, Tedra. My interest is basically starting from the point that I don't believe that people should be discriminated against regardless of sex, race, whatever it is. I also think that our community, and maybe that's my way of extending myself, that we need to be more compassionate to people who are vulnerable. And so that in its sense is what drives me. There are lots of areas. You talk about the same thing as Alyssa has said: women, children, the elderly, people who have, yes, I was about to mention, you said challenged differently or disabled, if you want to use that. And cutting across all of that, you have the LGBTQIA community, which then makes it even more special, so to speak, because it can be every single one of those things I've just said, plus that, and suffer great indiscrimination in the society in which we live. That's my interest. You know, I try to also, as I am growing, not just getting older, but people think, how could she say that? But growing spiritually, which is not religion, right? I totally have a different perspective on that. That I try, as I live and I read and I learn, to practice to live with love and compassion and to live with grace and courage. That's especially that. And all of that means that I must be able to see the human being for what he or she comes with me, not to judge that person, and to treat that person with ultimate respect.
You mentioned practice. And as a lawyer, I have to ask, you are integrally involved in what could possibly be something very historic in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. And for those of you who aren't aware, the local laws as it relates to buggery and gross indecency is being challenged. And you are on that legal team. What can you share with us, information that can be made available at this point to the public as it relates to that case? And also, can you contextualize it in the wider scope of the Caribbean movement?
Okay, so where do I start? I can start with our case here. So I'm one of 4 barristers on, and I say barristers because in this particular matter, many people may not be familiar with certain terms. They're solicitor. In St. Vincent's, a fused profession called a barrister and solicitor. I'm one of all those things. So barristers go to court, do the kind of advocacy, solicitors usually background. Okay. And sometimes when you have large cases, there's a split for convenience that some lawyers will do all of the preparation, the background work, and some lawyers will just do the advocacy in court. And some lawyers do both on the same team. Right. So I'm one of 4 barristers, and there are about 3 or 4 solicitors on this matter. Right? And so in 2019, we filed on behalf of 2 males, both of Ascension, both live abroad. One lives in the UK, one lives in the USA. And there's a constitutional claim, first of all, constitutional motion, challenging certain constitutional fundamental, well, not challenging, using the Constitution to challenge Section 146 and Section 148 of the Criminal Code. And 146 basically is buggery, and we know that's anal sex. And so if you are found guilty of permitting someone to commit it or committing it, then you are liable to the 10 years in prison. But that's the ultimate penalty. But as a background, though, I mean, this some people ask, well, why we do have these laws? And one of the things that we have to understand, 146 and any of these matters that deal with same-sex or homosexual relations come straight out of the UK. And that goes into a conversation where sometimes you hear them say, oh, well, same what you mentioned, there's an agenda that we are following, it's Western ideas and Western all that. So, okay, so where did the laws come from in the first place?
That's an interesting take.
Right. Where did they come from in the first place? Right? And so we have some colonial laws that we still use, still on the books. And in respect of the two claimants, as I said before, we're charging 146 and 148. And 148 deals with gross indecency. And gross indecency basically is talking about any sexual activity between same sex. And it's usually men and children. So you can have that as well applied to children and men. So we are at the stage of trial. It's been a long haul. And I can cross over in terms of the Caribbean movement, because this matter first started, I think, maybe 2016, correct me, Belize? Yes, Belize started there. And it has moved to Antigua and recently Barbados, there's some kids.
I think
Dominica.
Trinidad had...
Oh yes, let's not forget Trinidad. Yes,
no,
Trinidad.
you can legally marry there.
I don't know that. I think there was a chance, but I'm not sure. There was an appeal to it. Oh. Right. So we wait until the appeal outcome. And Dominica is also in progress. Barbados recently had their decision, which was in favor of and to strike down the legislation. And St. Vincent, believe it or not, I think we were the first behind Belize, 2019, 2016, Trinidad, I think Trinidad, and then St. Vincent and the Grenadines.
And
we're trailing last.
We're
trailing last.
Yet.
We're in trial. We're in trial now. So our last day is Monday of trial.
This coming Monday. In June.
Yes.
Pride Month.
We've had 4 trial days, and this is number 5 because we couldn't have it done in the 4 days that were allotted. And so we will complete hopefully tomorrow, and it will take some time for the judge to consider all of the evidence, adduce the trial, and all the legal submissions that have been filed. And maybe by October, so we may have a decision for St. Vincent and the Grenadines.
And you're confident that the team has put in the work?
Well, let me put it, people don't like to hear it. I don't think our case is different from any of the cases that went before. So I can't see how the decision is going to be any different from that has gone before. And basically, if you think about it in a TEDRA, I think what people struggle with, especially the gross indecency, what we are challenging, and people need to understand, we are not, a lot of the argument that comes thinks that you're opening up to all levels of immorality. That's one of the things that is attacked on. But you're talking about adults who are consenting to sexual activity between and amongst themselves. We are not opening any door, as far as our legal arguments are, for pedophilia and for any gross indecency with minors or anyone that is not giving consent. So I know we're talking about discrimination and same-sex. For instance, do you know on our laws, a man can be brutally raped and it's not defined as rape?
So for those of you watching and listening, did you know that? That's coming from Zita right there, that a man can be raped and it's
No, it's not defined as rape because it's just
defined as
buggery.
rape.
And remember, it's just defined, buggery only carry 10 years. Rape, which is defined as the penis penetrating the vagina without consent, is life imprisonment.
So technically, a man can't be raped in
A
St.
man cannot
Vincent,
be raped.
which is crazy. But I gotta ask you something else before I move on to Marlon. The concept of buggery. Because when you hear about buggery, a lot of people associate it man, right? And it's almost instantaneously linked to homosexuality. But if I understand correctly, a very heterosexual man
Yes. With a very
can,
heterosexual
with a very
woman
heterosexual girlfriend
or wife,
or wife, partner, as long as they engage in
anal sex, it's
then
buggery.
it's buggery. So it's still breaking the law.
Still breaking the law. And as an aside, I'll tell you this much. Just recently, I was acting amicus, friend of the court, to assist a young man who has been charged with attempted rape, vaginal, of course, because that's the definition in law, abduction, because he held on to her hand and tried to take her to a place that she didn't want to go, and buggery, because he also, well, it's not attempted, he was charged with buggery, because the prosecution is saying that he did have anal sex. So whether you are homosexual, man on man, or it is heterosexual, woman and man and woman, it is still buggery once it's anal sex.
So the law, for clarity, the law that your team is challenging is also going to impact heterosexual relationships.
Yes, but you know what? You know how society make up, right? Because the way we see this, it has to do with what society does not like, what society hates, what religion has said is an abomination. With
And that's
two
why-
men, not man and woman.
That's
two
why I
men.
wanted it clarified, because I think for many people it seems like an isolated situation where I'm not gay, I don't like men, that has nothing to do with me. But you could have a heterosexual relationship and essentially still be committing this crime that is on the books that is being
Right.
challenged. Okay. I appreciate that clarity. Marlon, I know we spent quite some time with Zita. We didn't forget you. And you, as the policy and program advisor, you have a very special lens from which you see and also from which you advocate. So contextualize for us your work. What do you do to advocate for people who are marginalized, including the LGBTQIA plus community?
I'm going to start from a point that Zita made. When we talk about LGBT people, most of the time society look as if they are just a small subset of our society, but they touch every subsection of our society. Everywhere you look, there is LGBT people within that society. So regardless of when we look at our policies that we advocate, whether it be national policy, regional policy, or even group policy, these policies impact LGBT people. So at the end of the day, if we're going to talk about freedom of expression, and we're saying that everybody has the right to express themselves however they wish to express themselves, why do we take that away from LGBT people? Is it not a violation of your very policy that you have actually articulated? If you're going to talk about access to healthcare, why do you take it away from LGBT people? Is it not a... So we have to, when we look closely, we have to be able to widen the scope of saying that LGBT people is not a subset of our society, but they are within every facet of our society. Can we create policy without leaving them out? And that's where the problem comes in. So for me, when I got into reproductive health, my focus was youth. And it was there I realized if I am going to cater to the youths of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, then I can't leave any subsect out. I have to cater to HIV, I have to cater to LGBT, I have to cater to those with disability. And if we leave one subsect out, then we have failed. And that is where my work comes in. That's where I try to show to people as I advocate that it is not that we are saying that we are asking you for space. We already have that space. They're already there, right? It is not a pie, and people look at it as if it's a pie. So if we say that the same privileges that you have, that LGBT community have that privilege, that your privileges become less. But it's not a pie. It is an infinite space. So no matter what LGBT community have, you still have those. Nothing is taken from you. And that's what my work surrounds in terms of helping people to understand that there's nothing you can do to push them out. They're already in.
Guys, we're flowing. The conversation is flowing. But listen, we do have to take our very first break. Don't go anywhere. If you're watching online, please share the link with your friends. And specifically because even if at this point you don't see yourself as an ally or you don't see yourself as a member, conversation often leads to understanding. And understanding can lead to respect. And respecting people's choices and understanding that people have a right to choose. But we're going to take a quick break. We will be right back. We are talking violence and discrimination against LGBTQIA plus members here in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. And of course, this is being spearheaded by none other than the non-profit organization Equal Rights, Access and Opportunities, SVG, Inc. We'll be right back. Violence and discrimination against LGBTQIA plus people here in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. Now, Alisa, I have to ask, I need for you to explain certain concepts around this entire conversation, especially with LGBTQIA plus community. You know, there are people who joke around, well, oh, it's the whole alphabet, but there are certain concepts behind sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression, and sex characteristics. And I'm just wondering if you can shed light on how you go about defining these things.
Okay, so let me see. I want to do this both thoroughly but somewhat quickly. All right, so let's start with sex. So frequently, like when we fill out forms and things like that, you'll just see male or female. But when we're talking about these things in this sort of setting, I'm going to be referring to sex as physical sex or chromosomal sex, basically biological sex, right? So that's determined by what is happening with you both chromosomally, in terms of your internal sex organs and the sex hormones that are secreted and your response to them, as well as whatever's happening externally. So I think one of the things that is critical for people to know, and a lot of people don't know this, it's not something that's commonly taught, and I actually was in something of a debate/argument recently, where somebody asked, well, am I supposed to believe that what I was taught in school in biology is simply wrong? And I'm like, no. Like many things that are taught to children, they are simplified, for ease. But even in terms of biological sex, it is possible to be intersexed, which means that you have some combination of physical and chromosomal and internal features that make your biological sex indeterminate. So that's biological sex. It can be male, it can be female, and it can be some things in between. Then we have your gender identity. That's who you understand yourself to be. Gender is socially constructed. What we think of as being a man or masculine and what we think of as being a woman or being feminine has to do with things that we've kind of decided upon as a collective, and we kind of police people according to them. I hate to use such a word as a police, but I mean, it does feel that way at times, right? You're told by the people around you what the expectations are around manness and womanness. So where you feel yourself to be within that is your gender identity, it's your personal understanding of yourself. Some people understand themselves to be masculine, some people understand themselves to be feminine, some people understand themselves to be gender fluid. I feel as though my gender identity can move. Some people understand themselves as being outside of it entirely and may feel to be agender. They're like, yeah, none of these constructs make sense to me. Or they may, within those persons who feel themselves to be fluid, they may say things like, I feel myself to be gender non-conforming, right? So that's gender identity. That's what you know about yourself. You cannot know someone's gender identity by looking at them. They would have to tell you. Which is why, based on some things that I've even recently learned, I'll say, a person can't misgender me. Because that's about how I understand me. Then there's gender expression. So what do I do, if I choose to show the world what my gender identity is, if I so choose to portray that, right? So today, for example, my presentation is fairly feminine or femme, right? I'm wearing clothing and identifiers that may be more typical of somebody who is feminine, but of course I'm mixing and matching a little bit because that's what I like, as somebody who's fairly genderqueer, like, I've got shorter hair, right? I might be signifying things with my jewelry. For some people, it's tattoos, right? But you can use these things to basically portray to the world where you feel yourself to be along a gender identity spectrum. And again, that can look different on different days too, right? So we've gone through physical sex, gender identity, gender expression. Now there's sexual orientation. Who am I attracted to? Who do I feel like I want to do things to? Like, that's your sexual orientation. So all those things are separate.
Bad things get you in trouble with the law.
Good consensual things. But that's sexual orientation, which, believe it or not, is different from sexual preference, because my preference may dictate who I find attractive within my sexual orientation. So simply saying that somebody is homosexual, and that's their sexual orientation, that I have a preference for persons whose gender identity is the same as mine, and potentially their physical sex is the same as mine. Still doesn't say what I like in terms of gender expression. I might like people whose gender expression is more in line with the expectations that are associated with their physical sex. So I might like somebody, so let's say I'm a man who is gay. I might like men whose gender expression is more masculine, more stereotypically masculine. Or I might like men who are more feminine, more effeminate, right? And that would dictate things around preference, right? So none of these things are the same thing. Physical sex is not gender identity, which isn't gender expression, which isn't sexual orientation, which isn't sexual preference. And you can't tell any of them by knowing any of the other ones. You can conflate them. You can maybe make some assumptions if you'd like, but you won't know definitively until somebody tells you.
Marlon, I feel like you want to jump in here. I feel like you might have some input here. What do you want to say?
No, but I have to totally agree with Dr. Alves and the science behind of this, because when I just got into reproductive health, I had to unlearn all of this, because I was of the view that we only have male, we only have female, and I have to realize that there's a big spectrum between there. And where do we put these people between there? And so we have a society that tends to label people by their sexual orientation that they perceived. I need to put that there. So once you perceive that this is somebody's sexual orientation, it could be because of their gender expression, or it could be because of sexual behavior, which is another topic that Dr. Alves did not touch, because sexual behavior does not dictate my sexual orientation. But if, for example, we see in our society where girls would tend to feel other girls up, grope them, spank their bottom, sometimes sit in their lap, walk hand in hand with them, but doesn't mean that their sexual behavior is their sexual orientation. It doesn't mean that they are attracted to other females, right? So that opened up the spectrum that we have to understand that all of these things are personal and within an individual, and the person have the right to live that without you assuming, and then by that assumption, perpetrate violence against them or stigmatize them, or your prejudice is then put forward to them. I am not responsible for what you believed of me. I'm only responsible for how I feel about myself. And that is the foundation of where all of the violence that we're going to talk about stem from, where other people believe that my perception of you should always be what you display yourself to be.
Now, I gotta ask you guys, because you just said, the both of you said there is a spectrum. And coming from a traditional society where it's black or white, is male or female, labels have been added to people who fall within the spectrum, but are not at the end. They're not male, or they don't identify as male, and they don't identify as female. And such labels include confused, crazy, got issues, don't know anything about themselves, and a lot of negative stereotypes are associated with people like that. Are people, when it comes to mental health, do you feel as though we consider the implications of someone's mental health when we just brush it off and say, they're confused, they're crazy, they ain't no?
I don't think we do. Like, I think we are at just the beginning phases of recognizing that it's incredibly dehumanizing to tell somebody, well, you don't really know yourself that well, or the way that you know yourself to be is somehow so divergent that it is repellent to other people. Like, that's damaging to personhood. And just, I think we are definitely at this place in our society where we're starting to realize the impact that even small things that are said. I mean, we talk about like microaggressions, but I don't know if anything is a microaggression. It's just aggression, right? But realizing that there are some people who are really suffering because of the fact that some people are so unwilling to even, like, let's take that argument of, oh, you're confused. Even if you were, because questioning is an orientation, by the way. And a person can know themselves to be a certain way at one point in their life and maybe have an experience later on when they thought that, oh, I thought that my sexual orientation was pretty set. But you have an experience that you didn't have before, and you start questioning again. Like, having enough kindness to give people the space to even question, I think, is important as well. So it's like, must it be confused? Can it be I'm exploring? Can it be I'm questioning, right? What's so wrong with questioning?
What's so wrong with questioning, right? And that's a good question within itself. See that? See what I did there? It's good with questioning. That's a good question. But I also need to ask another question, because this particular question is, I would say, part of the fundamental argument when it comes to your sexual choices. Are people born gay, or are they conditioned to be gay?
I'm happy you asked that question. That was something sorry. I'm happy you asked that question because I was hoping that, I know Alicia, I know, let's go with Dr. Al because we've been going with this Alyssa and Alicia training. I know you're not a medical doctor, but it will of course cross this in your work as to, I'll tell you this much, we were looking over some work and I came across it, let me look this up, because it is something in my mind, I'm not expert on it, that as well helps me to be able to respect people, given the fact that, let me put it this way, if I'm born this way and if it's biological, why would you want to create laws that criminalize who I am? Right? So, and even if I were to choose to be that way, why would you also want to criminalize if I'm not hurting someone else? So if my behavior, as I said, because it goes back to consenting, and the reason why sometimes I thought about whether it is that you're born this way. Before being a lawyer, I was a teacher, and I taught at grammar school, all boys school. And you have to wonder, if boys come in at 10 years old, 11 years old, and you may see, if I may want to use my own ignorance, behaving what we refer to as effeminate. Doesn't mean, as Alyssa's pointed out, that that is their sexual orientation, doesn't mean that's their sexual behavior, or whatever it is. But let's start from there of our own ignorance, because that's where the fear is, and where we start ill-treating, dehumanizing, and oppressing our little boys. We may see that, for one, we may be a little bit more permissive in our understanding of women. But that's because you're coming from a patriarchal society and male-dominated view that it's okay if women do it. It's not okay if a man do it. So the question of if you're born this way had struck me a long time ago when you're dealing with little boys who are going through, in inverted commas, that confusion, because you were not able to go home or act a particular way before mommy or daddy knocks that out of you. And I remember when my son started grammar school, a comment was made which struck me. I mean, I walked out, I took my son with me, his father walked out, and one other relative whose son was also starting the school at the time walked out. And that is because someone of authority at that school got up and in addressing all of the parents with their little boys said, and I want to tell you, there's some kind of behaviors that we see among these boys in this school, talking about homosexuality. It is not going to happen here and we won't tolerate it. This is young boys just starting the school. He doesn't even understand or know anything. But this is an educational institution. And going back to the question you asked about mental health, no, starting outright, if a little boy was confused or whatever it is, trying to sort himself out, trying to understand who he is at that time, here comes the trauma telling him, which affects his ability to do well in school, affects his ability to form relations with other boys in school. He may see him withdrawn and figure, boy, if only I'm friends with this person, they might find out, they might think of me differently. But we don't understand the kind of harm that we actually unleash on young people. And then this extends even greater on into the wider society. And as they grow up, they're not functional, stable human beings. And so you don't even understand, it may not simply be my orientation, my preference, whatever it is. It may be all of the trauma that I have already experienced before of not being treated as an equal.
I'm sitting here, and for those of you watching online or on TV, we do have a live audience. And you're speaking of trauma, and I'm seeing people in the audience reacting to that. I could see people wiping their eyes because clearly they've had their own journeys. And in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, it's not the easiest place to go through this journey. And this is why I keep saying conversation is so important, because you're saying this on camera and I'm seeing people wiping tears in the audience. because it hits home. It hits home for a lot of people who may be your friends, who may be your family, who may perfectly just be another Vincentian. And if we're talking about trauma, I think it's only logical that we delve into that a bit more right now. So what?
I took over what I think should have been for Alyssa's to answer. I want to. I don't know if you have an opinion of.
On the whole, are you born this
Are we
way
born
question?
this? So I'm really interested in hearing what you have to say on that.
And then you'll talk about trauma.
Of course. No, I'm actually hesitant to add anything onto your answer. And I'll tell you why. I don't think that we should have to be governed by the question of a biological imperative to give people their basic rights and dignities. So yes, I could sit here and have a conversation with you about what we do or don't know scientifically right now about the whys and wherefores of sexual orientation, and some people might find that interesting. I think since we're here to talk about violence and discrimination more specifically, that we should be talking about this from the space of, well, that's a person. And so I think that Sita answered beautifully, and I'm not gonna add on to it.
But if we're talking about discrimination, can you expound a bit more on how this discrimination faced by people who identify as part of the LGBTQIA plus community, how does it impact them?
Right. I mean, well, in the event that we had last week, there was a participant who said something really powerful. I tried and led the participants through an identity exercise. Put up different identifiers around the room, and I gave these question prompts and told people, move to the identity label that suits this for you. So there were things like race and biological sex and sexual orientation, religion. Like, what is the identity that you're most aware of every day, least aware of? What makes you feel most discriminated against? And a young participant said, yeah, I didn't really know where to go for some of these questions because I don't feel particularly discriminated against. And because this was somebody who is cisgendered, female, and as she was saying, like there isn't much about me that would lead someone to ask a question about me that might lead to me being discriminated against. At least that's how
Before
I
you
feel.
continue, you said cisgender.
Yes.
For people who don't understand that term, what does it mean?
Yes. So cisgendered as opposed to transgendered. So somebody who is cisgendered, it means that their gender identity, so what they understand themselves to be in terms of gender, is correspondent with the biological sex that is typically associated with it.
So it's a woman identifying as a woman.
Yes.
Okay. Or
Yes.
a born female identifying as a woman.
Yes,
Okay.
a person assigned female at birth.
Okay.
Yes. So as I was saying about this participant, she said, like, I feel like I'm very much unmarked. Well, that was my language back to her. I was like, so that's what it's like to be a part of an unmarked class of people. What it means is invisibility in a pleasant way, meaning that there aren't any particular barriers placed around my participation, or there aren't any particular things I have to think of before I leave the house. Now, if you are somebody who is from, and so I wouldn't just say minority, I want to say minoritized or marginalized population, because somebody's doing the marginalizing, right? If you're from one of those populations, and LGBTQAI persons are, you are moving through your life with the awareness of your identities, especially if you choose to be outwardly expressive about them, and the way that it's going to affect how other people perceive you, how they treat you. And some people are met with, sometimes there's the subtle passive-aggressive behaviors that you get, and then there's the more overt refusals for things like services or refusing to let people safely be in a given space. But all of those things over time are just like, they're damaging. Imagine kind of like water wearing away at a rock, right? They're stressful. right? They influence things like people deciding whether or not they can be freely expressive about who they are, whether or not they can engage in other parts of their life that are deeply important to them. So for example, there are persons who are LGBTQAI who are also deeply religious, but will I be able to find a church family or a congregation that's going to accept me? A person shouldn't have to feel that way, but all of those things are little things that are going to chip away at you. Make you vulnerable to other types of stressors, make you, for some people, they may isolate themselves, which isn't healthy. For other people, they may hide who they are. And that can also be unhealthy for them as well as for people around them. I don't have any single answer as to how it impacts people's mental health because it is so all-encompassing, right?
You mentioned hiding, and that's one of the things that from milling about and moving about, you realize that people are actually comfortable with the idea of someone hiding themselves than being true to themselves. Why? Why do you think that is?
Are you asking me that personally or as a mental health professional?
I'm asking you in the capacity that allows you to answer.
You know what? I think there's a few different reasons for that. Something that I had said earlier in response to Marlon and his recognition that, we're really asking people to question things that feel like fundamental beliefs. It's like you've got this building, you're asking me to pull at a load-bearing wall. And so I think that that's part of why. It's like, we also had this commentary last week from somebody who's right in the audience, saying that watching other people live out loud forces people to ask questions about themselves. And that is part of where I would just prefer if you, can you just wrap that up, please? So I don't have to start asking questions about myself. I think that's some of it. Some of it is fear. And a lack of understanding. It's I would prefer to just pretend that this isn't happening. Can we just not? But I think it is that it fundamentally rocks people's foundations, and that's why.
Marlon, from your policy and programming perspective, in terms of trauma, how can we possibly bring policies to the forefront? Of course, we have to get past the law, right? But bring policies to the forefront that can actually address some of the trauma that people go through. And also, perhaps you can comment on what are some of your experiences as it relates to trauma that you've heard from LGBTQIA plus people that you've interacted with.
So one of the first things about policy that I think most people underlook is the fact that when you are doing any policy work, you have to first think about the society that you're doing that work in. What is the culture of that society? What is the psychology of the people? And these are big barriers that you have to face, because it is one thing for you to, for example, let me use this example. There's this big example of a big NGO that went into Africa to have a meeting. And while they were there, they saw that the women were all congregating at the river, and they would use this river as their bathroom, for the drinking water, for everything. They do everything in the river. And so they decided, let's create pipe-borne water to them. And so they took pipe-borne water to them, and a year after they went back, and none of the women were using the pipe-borne water. When they investigate, the river was the only place they felt free from the men of their society. So it was not a matter of unsanitary or whatever. The fact is, their policy should have been around keeping these women safe. So that's when we talk about policy, we have to look at the society that we're in. In our society, and I'm going to say this, we are relatively Christian. Or, I put it this way, we are conveniently Christians, right? And we have to take that into consideration, that is the foundation of where most of our teaching comes from. From since we are a little boy, little girls, growing up, we have been taught these are the precepts by which you should live by. And so as Dr. Alvis said, and as I said before, that we have to unroot all of this. So we have to ask ourselves, are people willing to have those conversations? And that is where we have most of the fight. Because some colleagues of mine, I think it was last week, were having a discussion, and one of them said, I have to protect my son. And I'm in there, this is our safe space. This is where we can actually say and put things out there. And I'm like, protect your son. What are you protecting your son from? If people have the right to consent and use their body for sexual pleasure as they will, what are you really protecting your son from?
And this is someone whose line of work is advocacy.
Not necessarily.
Oh, okay. Just checking, because I was about to say they're in the wrong line of work.
But that happens in the region a lot, though.
Because within the advocacy world, that happens a lot as well. People tend to separate their personal life from their advocacy work, right? But I'm looking at it and the very fact, and I'm saying, if you understand really, as Zita points out, what this law prevents, you would be happy to have it removed. So to talk about trauma, so that is in terms of policy and what we have to look forward to when we're looking at policy, even when you're pulling policies apart, because sometimes, even from the government point, they don't even think about the policy, they think about what gets them the most votes. And that creates a whole set of problems for society. So in terms of trauma, I like to, when people talk about LGBT community, LGBTQI plus community, I have to say to them, have you ever sit and speak with a member from the community?
And that's a good question, because having had that experience, it really changes what you think.
Yes.
I mean, you may leave that conversation and still feel how you feel, but when you have that conversation and you, at some point, something must register that this is just another human.
Right, that is
But
so true.
you mentioned something about government, and currently Jamaica is under constitutional reform. I think there's a motion or something, but that part of their law is not being looked at. It's not being addressed.
Right.
They're not going to attempt to overhaul their laws as it relates to not sexual orientation, to buggery. And I think it's buggery and abortion, the two pieces that they're not willing to look at. But we're going to take another quick break. When we come back, we're going to touch on the various sectors or important stakeholders within the society and how they possibly, I don't want to say contribute, but may contribute or directly or indirectly towards discrimination and violence against LGBTQIA+. And also, we need to come up with some solutions before we leave here today. So we will be right back here with Dr. Alisa Alves, with Zita Banwell, and with Marlon. Marlon, you realize I haven't said your last name yet.
Yeah, that's because I'm forever young.
With Marlon Forever Young. No, but seriously.
Yeah, it's young.
Marlon, okay, now I get it, Forever Young. I was a bit slow there, right? But we will be right back. Don't go anywhere. And welcome back, guys. You're watching IKTV on local cable as well as online on Facebook. We are talking LGBTQIA plus violence and discrimination experienced by members of that community here in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. And I know using the word community rubs a few Vincentians the wrong way. I've been following the discussion online over the last week or so, and it's you hear it a lot. There is such a community. There is no such community in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. We don't have that community here. Reality check. Yeah, right, because people exist, right? And there's a network, there are support groups and support mechanisms in place to support people who belong to that community. Of course, this panel discussion was conceptualized by Equal Rights Access and Opportunities Inc., SVG Inc. Let me get that right before Joshua jumps on screen and strangles me. But guys, there are many different stakeholders involved in this conversation, not just the advocates and allies, not just the people who identify, but a wider group of people. All of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, really and truly, especially with the lobbying challenge. But in terms of discrimination and violence, do you think that stakeholder groups exist locally that, whether directly or indirectly, perpetuate this violence against LGBTQIA plus people? So let me know, yes or no, and if it happens to be yes, exactly how? So who wants to take that one first? That one is up in the air. Let's go with you, Marlon.
There are various stakeholders that contribute to the violence, and some of them are doing it without knowing that they are doing it. So we have, for example, if we look, and I spoke about culture, I spoke about psychology. So people are of the view that they hold a moral high ground, right? And some people believe that their morality is supreme. You understand? It comes from a deity, and because it comes from a deity, whatever we believe is actually the truth, and anything that goes against that truth cannot be accepted into society, and fail to recognize that you're dealing with human beings. And in so doing, you're taking away their right, you're taking away their dignity and respect as an individual. And so doing, in that essence of that supreme morality, and there are those who think that they are the gatekeepers of our morality. If we go into those who think that they are the gatekeepers of our morality and we dissect what happened within those organizations, we're going to be here until next year talking about morality.
I feel like you're talking coded, Marlon. What do you mean? Break it down for us.
So let's put it as clear as we can put it. If we look at the church, and there are various sectors when we talk about the church. Some people say, oh, I'm non-denominational. Some say, oh, we are not this. But if we just look at that belief system that they have, and when I talk about belief system, we're talking about where people get their conscience from, because I believe that our conscience is our highest authority. It's what leads us to do whatever we do. So what influences your consciousness? And we have, for example, in the church where we teach the very fact about sexual immorality. We speak about, for example, I like this. I like when people come to me and say, oh, God destroyed an entire city, which is actually two cities. It's Sodom and Gomorrah. But when they say a city because of homosexuality, I say, using your text that you consider to be the moral high ground, prove to me that it destroyed those cities because of sexual immorality. When we sit down and we go through, they can't really prove that. But there's somebody stood on an altar and propagated such stuff for them, right? We look at the very fact that they said that Jesus is that example that we should follow. But when we look at how Jesus dealt with people who were not of the same beliefs and practice as him, it is nothing to how they are treating people today. So the question we have to ask ourselves, what really are they defending? You understand? Are we supposed to treat each other with love? Or are we supposed to actually treat them with disdain because they are not part of us?
You just touched on the church. It's a very touchy thing, because religion on a whole, and people might not like to hear this, but religion to an extent is almost the absence of logic. And let me contextualize
I might agree with you there,
Let me contextualize that. And because a lot of things in religion you can't explain. You really just have to believe. If you are off that belief system, you really just have to accept it and believe it in the faith and everything. Because you cannot explain some of the things. And that's, so let me just clarify. I'm not saying religion makes no sense. I will never say that because I do believe I am religious to an extent. But all that to say, I'm going to pick one religion. You know what? I'm not going to pick one religion.
No, let's not pick because...
Can you be religious and still be LGBTQIA plus? Is that possible?
You don't think so?
On that, I don't think I have a definite answer there, because if we're going to go in terms of, because of my background, because of my professional training, I believe that the Constitution always is the highest authority, and the Constitution of Christians is the Bible, and clearly the Bible states in terms of people of the LGBT community, you know, that they say, oh, you can't be this, you can't be that. I think a person can be spiritual and be a part of the LGBT community. So I'm going to differentiate between religion
this is
or
getting good,
being a Christian.
I sense a disagreement coming. This is getting good.
Dr. Albert is going to disagree with me.
I deeply disagree, and I'm agnostic.
Yeah.
No, there are people of all walks of life, all sorts of sexual orientations who love them some Jesus.
Right, and I agree with that.
And there is no conflict between the two. If we're going to get, actually the place where we might land ourselves in hot water is what I would say is if we're going to use, because first of all, let's just start, I'm not a theologian, I'm no divinity scholar, right? Whatever I know about religion is, little smatterings that I've educated myself about, because, religion is an interesting philosophical topic, even if you're not somebody who goes to church. But if we want to use the word as being the definitive place that we go back to determine what is sacred, what is profane, what is allowable, what is not allowable, then we're going to get into a conversation about translations.
Right, that's where I was coming.
And we're going to get into a conversation about what words were chosen, what kind of nuance there is between ancient Hebrew, ancient Greek, ancient Latin, modern day English, and what has gotten lost. What have people chosen to leave out for their convenience? And then we're going to be here whole night.
That is so true.
So what I would say, I think there's a difference between a belief system and so I was given this definition as part of a history of psychology class, actually. Because I had a person who was deeply religious who taught me that class and taught us the connections between psychology and Protestantism. It's actually pretty interesting. So even though I don't practice Christianity as a religion, if I'm to say I'm divested of it completely because I'm a psychologist, I'm kind of not. But basically the idea that a religion is a way to grapple with life's existential questions. So I think there's a difference between that and the prescriptivism that's attached to it. That's doctrine.
I was coming to that.
Doctrine is not religion.
I was coming to that.
And religion is not faith.
I was coming to that.
Those are all different things. So therefore, there are some people who may be doing things that maybe are adverse to some people's doctrine, but does it agitate against them having a particular religious faith? I don't think so.
But would those faiths, well, we see in St. Vincent it doesn't, but we see in the wider world where those faiths, some of them are open to including these people in their congregations, leading some of these
or cultures where they're revered. You think of people who are Hindu. In India, there are persons who are known as hijras. A hijra is a person who is what we might say in the Western world, they're transgendered. Maybe you might even say two-spirited, right? And these are people who are thought of as having a very special connection to the spiritual world because of them embodying maybe a spectrum of different gender identities, right? So there are spaces and places where it's tolerated, I think, and there's other cultures as well. Like I said, I'm also not a gender scholar. I'm only a psychologist, folks. I'm a psychologist who reads broadly about other things. But yeah, there's a host of cultures where it's even interwoven into their faith system.
So besides religion, and during this broadcast, we've used religion and Christianity interchangeably. I do want to contextualize that.
Yes.
That it is problematic, but it's also on the basis because much or the majority of St. Vincent and the Grenadines relies on that. But I do want to distinguish, just for everybody who's watching, it's not the same thing, right? But besides religious stakeholders, locally, are there other stakeholders whose responses to LGBTQIA plus people may be problematic and may lend itself to discrimination and violence?
Before I pass the mic over, I believe that if we look at our entertainment sector, that's another big area there in terms of when you look at our music, we look at in terms of incidents to the music. And that's because most of our music is influenced from outside, what is popular at the time, if you really look at our music. So most of our music is influenced by what is coming out of Trinidad, what is coming out of Jamaica, right? So whatever seems to be popular there tend to be what influence our music. So what our DJs play, what our radio announcers allow, the language that they speak, sometimes, well, most of the time, perpetuate that type of violence. And as I began by saying, sometimes it is not knowing, because we are doing it in the sake of entertainment, not knowing that we are destroying other people's mental health and even asking other people indirectly to be violent towards other people of different beliefs.
Marlon, let me jump in here because I think Alisa wants to say something. On the issue of entertainment, that's one of the groups we've seen a shift in. And even a Caribbean-based shift, much smaller and slower than international. But recently, TOK came up with a statement saying they are not going to perform their Chichi Man song anymore. Beanie Man has said he's not going to sing some of his songs. Buju has renounced Boom Bye Bye completely. He won't perform it. So Jamaican artists, quite a few of them have now recognized, late, but as we would say, better late than never, recognize that their words do have power, and and it has implications for them on a dollar and cents level. It has a lot of implications for them. But I don't know if I am to look at the landscape here in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, the musical landscape, if a change or a shift is anywhere near. What do you guys think? Do you think we're on that brink? We're there yet? We haven't touched the surface?
I am no entertainment specialist, and I had to pay attention to radio or television. Honestly, I spare myself the trauma. But I don't think so. I don't know that our local entertainers, though, are that their music is discriminatory against the LGBTQI community as much as against women. I mean, we're not here discussing women today.
That's a very strong point.
You're gonna love my thought.
That's a very strong point, because now you have me thinking, yes, we're talking about discrimination against LGBTQIA+, but when you class that especially with women who belong to that society, it's a double whammy.
Yes. Right.
Because women are constantly objectified in Caribbean music, in Vincentian music, and a lot of people are not going to want to acknowledge
I'm
that.
going to pass my mic over to Alyssa,
No,
but I just
because-
want to talk about this sexual violence perpetuated in the music against
Yes,
women.
Yes.
That is a serious concern. And I don't know if that is going to be addressed anywhere soon, because unfortunately, women themselves seem to...
Bump and grind, push back, bumper in the air to these songs.
That's mild. Just listen to the lyrics of some of these songs, what they want to do with women, or what they're doing to women. Just listen to the lyrics.
No, I was having that exact thought while Marlon was speaking, because I think if we're going to have a conversation about how various sectors of society, various key social stakeholders, the churches, the schools, civil society organizations, but of course our private sector businesses, entertainers, how those things contribute to an atmosphere that ends up being homophobic, biphobic, transphobic. What we really probably need to talk about is the fact that all of these, so homophobia is just sexism and patriarchy's baby son.
Yeah.
We have to talk about patriarchy, and we'd have to talk about sexism, because part of the derision that people direct, particularly toward persons who are perceived as male and who may have gender expression that is female, it has to do with them being adjacent to being a woman, and that being seen as something weak.
Less. Mm-hmm.
That's where that is. So if we're going to talk about homophobia, part of all of it is of a piece. We'd have to talk about sexism. We'd have to talk about gender-based violence, because that's what creates the setting that allows for violently taking away people's rights and discriminating against people. That's where it sits. It's like you get the environment that allows it in the first instance, and then it just can be unleashed on anybody.
Who's responsible for that re-education? Not even re-education, but that unlearning and then re-education of these issues. Is it an individual responsibility? Is it a collective responsibility?
Both.
The socialization process. So you have the family, you have the church, you have the community, and you have the institutions. So there it is. So it's a collective effort. And maybe you want to say, where do we start?
Where do we start?
Who takes it up and starts the baton?
And the reason why I'm asking, and people tend to get this confused in that, because we're having a conversation about it, it's being forced on you. And that's the word that is often being used. You're forcing this. You're pushing an agenda. I don't want my kid exposed to this. Where do we start with, especially that group of people who may be the hardest group to reach, or to help understand that, as you guys have expressed, these are humans. You want your individual rights. These people also want their individual rights. How do we reach that group?
I'm going to start, and I'm going to be brief. And I because I'm a firm believer that everything starts at home. I think that's probably the best place, or it may happen naturally. And I say that because if we start, it's my child. It's our child. It's your nephew. It's your niece. However you want to put your cousin. And I think we've seen changes here where families are more accepting of the different behaviors of children, and call it sexual behavior, whatever is on the LGBTQIA plus community, especially fathers. I think it's really profound when you see fathers come out and say, that's my son, especially if it's a boy, and I don't care what anyone says. It's going to take time. But the advocacy first starts with at home, with the parents, loving and caring and protecting, and also advocating for outside of that small space in the house. In the schools, don't treat my child differently. When you make sure that you're going to give them that confidence, I can apply for any job that I want to apply for. Or I can be anything that I want to be regardless of how, whatever it is society perceives me to be. So the strength, the courage, the faith, everything you want to think about starts there. And it then just expands outwards. Because it's how some laws get changed and it influences policy. Sometimes it starts with one person, having had some traumatic experience, something has happened, and that parent or that family continues to advocate and advocate years in, years out. And you hear some piece of legislation has been created, or you hear policy start for the protection or whatever the case may be. So I think that's the first place we may see, or we have already started seeing it. It just simply means perhaps those parents need to start sort of collectively start looking, what you want to call a support group, whatever it is, they start grouping themselves together to have that type of force.
This is kind of a tangential thought, but something just occurred to me. Like you mentioned that so many things that happen, they start in the microcosm of somebody's home, and saying that, like, you know, there are parents who may eventually be, you know, really powerful advocates from watching what their own children experience. But I'm thinking of a particular group of people, I'm thinking of a particular family. I'm not going to say their name on air, but I'm just thinking there are other people who are important to talk about too, where people who have families that were very accepting from jump, and where a person has had a very joyful queer experience. Because I think just like Blackness, where people think that everything that has to do with a Black person is nested in struggle, that everything that has to do with being queer has to do with, you know, this life of pain and struggle. No, there are people having affirming experiences within their families, with families who, for whom it was not a fraught thing, that can be normal too, and that can be okay. Because I think this is just me speculating, just based on parents who bring children into my practice, for example. Parents, in most cases, are very concerned with protecting their children. And you will hear people say things like, I don't want that life for him, her, them, because I perceive that terrible things will happen to them. So being able to see that, no, there are other people who are thriving, I think those stories too are gonna be important, that families where they're like, yeah, this is how we've navigated this, and this is how it's been fine, right? Those people becoming really powerful advocates, in addition to those who may have suffered and become advocates on the heels of that.
There is also a group, and when I say a group, there are also people within society who would be of the feeling that my opinion is, I disagree with this, and you need to respect my opinion in disagreeing with this. There is a very hardline approach for some people who would not change, and no amount of TV time, discussions, or anything would really get to those people. Is it wrong of them to feel that way? Or are they just as entitled to feel that way?
I'm actually curious about Marlon's answers, just because of all of your years of advocacy work. Because I'm sure you've encountered people like that, right?
Yeah. But is the word entitled? Because that's been floating around. Everybody thinks that they're entitled. But it's okay for you not to be in agreement with anything that we have said, or those who might be of defying the norms of society. That's okay. We're not asking you to be or accept them. All we're saying for you to see people as human beings. And as human beings, respect them as such. Treat them with the dignity of such. That's all. We're not saying that you have to believe everything that we're saying. We're not saying that the practice that they might choose, that you have to agree with it. Everybody is entitled to their own belief. My belief system might be different to that of Zita, might be that of Dr. Alves, and we have seen some different belief system here today. But doesn't mean that because I believe this way, I'm supposed to treat Dr. Alves with disrespect, and I'm supposed to violate her as a human being. That's all we're asking. So it's okay for you not to believe. But going back to the question before, and Zita talks about family and where we need to start, we have to understand in the context of where is it that this shift in thought is going to happen for parents. That is important, because if we're going to say we start with the family, what is responsible for that shift in thought? Go back to that colleague that said, I'm just protecting my child. You understand? And that has been the mentality of a lot of parents. But your child is left for 2-3 hours a day on a tablet. What really are you protecting your child from? Your child is actually being listening to music, you understand? Your child at the end of the day is left to ride the bike on the street without helmet. What really are you protecting your child from? when you say you're protecting your child? And these are questions that people are afraid to ask themselves. Or when you ask them these questions, they get very defensive because they have to face the reality that our biases, and everybody have biases. Me coming on this show, I had to check myself of my biases as well in order for me to be very objective in my answers. So all of us have biases, and we have to check our biases and to see, am I projecting my biases on anyone? And that's where the problem is. Because not because I believe something means that I have to project it on anyone or ask everyone to believe it.
Can I say?
Go right ahead.
I think it's almost as if saying this goes around like that, you don't have no starting point. Because he says, what triggers, what creates that shift in the parents' mind? For some people, as Alyssa said, it starts naturally. It's my natural love and affection for my child that I've brought into this world. It happens naturally. So that's a group of people there. So what you have asked is, what about those parents who are of the conservative, traditional approach and live in a zone of fear, that I don't want my son or my daughter to be like this. And most of it has to do as well, maybe how are they going to be treated by society, you know.
Yeah.
That is it.
Yeah.
I don't want to deal with that of my child being, because I am helpless and powerless and I don't know how to deal with it. I may feel embarrassed and ashamed because there's fear associated with it. And because people say that person is less than. Here comes the the community-based organizations, the community organization, NGOs that are going to say, listen, we are here saying that there are certain things that, you know, when you look at the Constitution, when you look at just for being a human being, love and affection, and maybe even some aspects of the Bible you want to look at, that this organization, just from hearing, you know, some people go to a crusade and say, oh, by the time the pastor says this and that, it drew me to that pastor and I go to the church. Well, it is that when organizations are speaking, if you're listening, it is simply saying, don't be afraid, don't be ashamed, we are here to help. And then we can help you navigate that process. We can help you create that safe space for your child. And then if you have, certainly move up the chain, because sometimes, unless, as Marlon said before, it's a political advantage, politicians are not going to touch it. So on this particular issue, don't expect politicians to touch and move on it. And that's one of the reasons why we're in court. Because if it is that politician and legislative body thought that this was something in terms that we need to address right here at Parliament first, as we're moving along in 21st century, then we didn't have to go to court and challenge that. It's not a sexy topic. It's not a very nice topic. It is not going to go well with the church. It's not going to go with how we will. And one of the things that people say, well, the Constitution says it's based on the supremacy of God. It didn't say Christianity. It says based on the supremacy of God. So go back to what Alyssa talked about just now, about religion and how it is that we may be bogged down in one aspect of it and what we were taught and believe it to be. Right? So then, so you have those other, call it the stakeholders, whether you move up, but I think, maybe where I sit, the individual and community-based organization advocates are the best places to start. And when you become that powerful voice, politicians will listen to you. That's when politicians will listen. It goes back to the vote.
Speaking of vote and politics, and this case being challenged, within St. Vincent and the Grenadines, we do see people belonging to the LGBTQIA+. I gotta ask something, a little, why don't we say LGBTQIA+ers rather than the same people? Because it's so long to say. Has anybody suggested that before?
I think the reason that we say that is because of, so there's differing feelings about these things. So this business of person-centered language,
okay,
that you don't want to,
because
you don't want to advance
it's
the
just
label
like it's such
first.
an easier way.
Right, we want to emphasize people's personhood first,
Noted.
and then identifiers secondary.
But that's true.
That
right.
too.
So as I was asking, you did mention that the two people you're working on behalf of, the team is working on behalf of, one is based in the UK and the other is based in Canada?
USA.
The US. And we do see members, Vincentians, who identify as part of the LGBTQIA+ community, often migrating to live their truth, so to speak, completely leaving their lives behind here in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, and truly not representing themselves as they feel most free until they leave. Why is there such a drive to leave St. Vincent? And I know you guys are going to say, well, this whole conversation was based on it. But for people now tuning in, for people who need more direct language, what is driving them away?
Fear, right? And also an inability to live in a way that feels authentic, in a way that encompasses your wholeness, right? It's very difficult for human beings to live that way. Of course, there are some people who suppress, and I think I had touched this I had alluded to it earlier, that like this is among the mental health harms, when people are forced into an existence that isn't truly representative of them, that it's damaging for them, but it also can be damaging for other people, both in terms of the things that this person may be doing, like feelings don't just evaporate, right? They end up getting manifested in other ways, but also in terms of, people who they maybe are being dishonest with. Like that, there's harm there as well. So I've digressed. The people who leave because when they do the math for themselves and they think, okay, well, what is an existence in which I'm going to be able to safely be myself? It's not. They look around and they decide it's not here. And I would say particularly people assigned male at birth and who are male and who are queer are particularly sense themselves to be in danger in St. Vincent in terms of being able to live the way they would like to live.
You just touched on something. Males assigned at birth who are LGBTQIA+, treated differently than women who are LGBTQIA+. I have to ask, what is the root cause of that difference in treatment? Because let's be real, women in the LGBTQIA+ supposedly get a pass. A lot of men find it. It's still dangerous. But. Yeah. So when I say get a pass, and maybe I should be a bit more careful, they are less scrutinized in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. They are at less risk of physical violence, and a lot of heterosexual men find it sexy, attractive. They like girl on girl action. They love the porn in relation to that. But why is that? Because it's almost like a double standard.
But it still goes back to patriarchy. Because, so first of all, let's talk about this whole question of just like lesbianism for the male gaze, right? When a straight man is imagining two lesbians together, he's probably imagining two young, lithesome femmes, right? And not all lesbians look that way. When you start talking about a woman who has a gender presentation that is masculine at the center, then you do start seeing the discrimination pop out. Yeah. So it is connected with that, right? But I think it's that people find gay men, to be particularly triggering because it really hits at the fundamentals of what's needed to uphold patriarchy. If in order to uphold patriarchy, we need to keep a very tight rein on what is manness and what is maleness. And if we start knocking at that, well then, oh gosh, the whole thing is gonna come falling down, including capitalism, but that probably is even a bigger conversation, right? But I think it's that. It's because that the idea of a man who, Lord, we say this on TV, like a man who's being penetrated, I think is the thing that people find very triggering. It's like, oh, that's quintessentially female somehow. The idea of submitting, and then the concurrent connotation of weakness that comes with that. It's that, and they don't get the same ick when they think of two women.
Okay, Joshua, I'm going to ask you live on air, how are we on time? I want to make sure we are on time.
What about
So,
your question?
right, that's what I wanted to move into, and that's why I did a time check. We do have, as I've said before, we do have a live audience, and we do have someone wanting to ask the panelists a question. So, can you take the mic over? If you want, you can introduce yourself and you can identify which of the panelists you're directing your question to. It should be on. Hold it right at your mouth.
Okay,
Put it closer. Yes. No, you're minding the gutter.
I did not say anything. Hi, good afternoon. My name is Tristan Macmillan. I work for Vinci Chap. One of my questions were, what's the next step in case of like, see that we're in court now dealing with the whole buggery law, and you said that Monday's supposed to be the last court date and stuff like that. And what if they don't remove this law? You know, like if after we don't go through all this court and they decide, you know, y'all don't have enough necessary evidence and necessary information to get rid of this law, what's your next step to get rid of this law? And what's your step if this law is passed? Because if this law is passed, we have to think about, yes, we're being discriminated now, but I think if the law is passed to remove the law, it's gonna get worse before it even gets better. Because especially for men like me, who's more openly, and men like Jada and stuff like that, who are more openly about their sexual orientation and their sexual identity, it's gonna put like a target on your back. So what are we doing are we gonna have safe spaces enforced for like LGBTQ youth to go to when after this law is passed? Because after this law is passed, I mean, I'm pretty sure the country will be in a little uproar. Like we will be pressed more than we pressed right now. So yeah. And my other question was
Wait,
okay,
Tristan.
sorry.
Let's answer that one first, and then we'll get to the other, just so that they don't forget what they're answering. So who wants, Zita, you want to take the lead on this?
Sorry. I guess, Tedra, this is really a way to lift here. So let me explain. So yes, Monday is the last trial day. And after trial, we may have oral submissions, which is that your legal arguments before the judge, or we can just rely on written submissions, which is you consider all that has gone before in court and the examinations of the witnesses, and you then, we have already filed some submissions, so you can extend on that, right? And then we wait until the judge makes her decision. So the question you asked is, what if when the judge brings back her decision, it is not in the favor of the claimants, which is not deeming that Section 146 and 148 are unconstitutional? There's another stage that we would go, and that's the Court of Appeal. And it would appear to, even if I didn't mention all the up, maybe because most people, I'm not sure if most people know. So there are two claimants, and there's one defendant who is the Attorney General, who represents the state. There is two interested parties. One is, a group of churches, and the other is Vinci Chap, right? So if you were to look at who are friends, it would be the claimants and Vinci Chap, and then, so friends or allies, and then it will be the churches and the Attorney General, and the Attorney General, sorry. So if it is then the Court of Appeal, that's the second tier, let's just say, obviously we prevail, we are happy, and the church or the Attorney General decides that they want to appeal the judges, the first instance judge, which is now the High Court's decision, which is in favor of the claimants, they can then take it to the Court of Appeal, right? That's only legal arguments, no evidence. So there's no listing of the evidence again. And if it is that the Court of Appeal rules in favor and agrees it's in favor of the claimants, then whether it's the church or the Attorney General, they could say, we want to go to the Privy Council. Now, the UK Privy Council, as it says UK, that's in England. That's our final court here, not the CCJ. And that will be the final determination of the matter legally in terms of the case that is brought, right? That's if it goes that route. It can be that we prevail and nobody bothers, but certainly if we do not prevail at first instance, we will be appealing, right? Okay. So let's just say we win and nothing else happens, and you're asking. So the next move will be that the court says that you have to strike down those legislation, Section 146 and 148. Most of the time I say to people, that may be well and good. But also fundamentally, I think we've touched on it before, we can have the most powerful laws or remove the most draconian laws or the most discriminatory laws. And if we're not working on our society, our consciousness, then we still have problems. So you think that maybe at the same time while we're doing this, we're working all of this conversation, and Chedra mentioned it first. People said, don't force it down my throat, don't tell me this, don't tell me that. Marlon touched on it. We are not saying that we are forcing something on you. We are saying to you, let's start at the point of recognizing, I am a human being, you're a human being, and you need to be respected as a human being. We say the dignity of man, all the special values that come with you as a human being, and it comes with humanity, resides in me, resides in you, resides in everybody else. Some people even say, well, some of these human beings treat animals better than they treat other human beings. But I say leave space for everything that's on earth and alive. We need to treat animals also good. We need to treat humans also good. So that answers the question. Parliament hasn't done it. I think I mentioned it already. It hasn't taken up the initiative to say, well, listen, most of the House think that we should move that. Tedra also pointed out that in Jamaica, that they're recognizing that that stays, right? And the only choice that we have to have them off the books would be the challenge that we have here. And before I hand over the mic, let me just say this. I mean, this matter is public, is a public hearing, and you would hear responses or certain evidence that come out from the defendant's side, such as, well, we are not activating or doing anything with the law itself. Like, it's sterile, it's dead, it's there, but why is it there? So the point of the matter has been, well, nobody has been locked up for being, part of the LGBTI community. Nobody goes to anybody's home, because remember, gross decency talks about certain behaviors in public and in private. But their argument has been that we don't go to anybody's home, peep through anybody's window, knock on anybody's door and say, hey, we are under arrest, right? I'm saying to you what is said. I couldn't say what happens. It's for what comes out in the court, and I have no other evidence that's adduced in court. I'm sure there may be people who say, that is not true. Police came to my door already, or police came to my house already, and this is what happens. But as far as the case has been played out, the evidence of the state through the police is that that does not happen. Okay?
Tristan, your second question.
Okay, so my second question is, so what are we doing because we're in the 21st century, in 2023, and the younger generation is a little bit more sexually liberated. They live their lives a little bit more loudly than back in my day when you know what I mean? So, like, what are we gonna do in the case of educating young people and trying to remove the brainwashing that's been placed on us for generations upon generations, especially on the older folks? Because all the people are gonna be stuck in their ways. And instead, what are we gonna do to educate them, and especially like in schools, because they have this thing where they're saying we're forcing our beliefs onto children. Really and truly, I don't think you can force your beliefs onto anybody, because I knew I was gay from the moment I came out of the womb. So I don't think anything was forced upon me. But like children, they have little gay boys and little gay girls in school, and they feel so alone. What are we doing to make them feel like they're not alone, that you have somebody to talk to? How are we going to educate children on not just acceptance but tolerance? Because you don't have to accept me, but if you can learn to tolerate people and see them in a whole different light, it can lead towards accepting them, and it can lead towards having bigger conversations. So what are we going to do where that is concerned, especially in schools?
Now, as a school and clinical psychologist, I'm going to ask Elisa to answer that question.
So I think some of it has to do with exactly what you said toward the end. That my thinking was that these things happen in stages, right? That tolerance precedes acceptance, right? And I think as a society here in St. Vincent, we struggle with tolerance just generally. Like the notion of, I can successfully hold space with this person who is very different from me in a host of ways. Religious belief, political affiliation, skin color in some cases, class. Like, we really struggle with that as an idea, right? So when I look at schools, for example, and when, I would have started my mental health profession insofar as when I was actually being paid for it as a guidance counselor working in schools in St. Vincent. Like, this is just post-master's degree. And so there were people from that profession now who would still ask for help, viewpoint, consultative support. And I talk a lot about school-wide positive behavior supports. Just the idea of creating cultures in schools that are kind. Just a basic culture of kindness and inclusion at baseline that encompasses everybody. That when we talk about somewhere being a safe space, we aren't just talking about sexual orientation or gender identity, we are talking about everybody, right? So if we have more language around that, I think owing to our colonial past, I don't know if we sometimes know much about kindness or love. Some of what people purport as being about, it's what we're really talking about is obedience. And then sometimes there's also, you've got the crowd of people who talk about how do you foster obedience among young people, and then you've got people who talk about protocol. And I also think of these as nice people. I'm skeptical about nice people, right? It's different from kindness, right? It's I'm doing this because it's prescribed. I think we have to start at that space of like, what is kind? What allows me to meet fellow humans as humans and give them space to exist? Just at the beginning, and then we can go from there. And I think that will help us in St. Vincent with a host of things beyond even LGBTQIA persons being targets of violence and discrimination. Like, I think that we're harsh, just as a people. We are. We're very critical and we're harsh. And we could stand to be less of that.
Thank you very much, Joshua. If no one else from the audience has questions, you can bring the mic back to the front. All right, we do have another question from the audience. After the question segment, though, we will wrap up, let you guys get your final words in.
So, not so serious question, like you know, it's a little off topic, but you guys were talking about the laws against buggery and stuff in St. Vincent, but I was also concerned about the laws against sex toys. And, you know, wondering if that's going to be coming up next on the agenda and what we're going to, you know, how we're going to be able to, you know, combat some of these things, because people need to, you know, take care of themselves. So, yeah.
I just have one short answer to that. The short answer to that is, are you willing to be a claimant or an applicant? Lots of people ask that, so it's it's referred to as an indecent object, and there's isn't a piece of legislation on it, you know. It's if you check in, I think it's customs, the laws that regulate customs.
Yes.
It's listed there.
Yes.
So what I would say is that if someone wants to challenge that, then you just find a lawyer who is willing to what's called judicial review, a decision. So you've tried to import something as a personal item, and the customs has, you know, prevented you from having it, seized it, and you're asking the court to judicial review it, that decision. And that decision would make way, hopefully, for lots of people, and will have implications for whether or not you can have the so-called indecent object in your home. Because the other thing about it is that it's on the, you may say it's on the books as illegal, but people use them, import them, and have them in St. Vincent. And sell them.
I hear the cheeky laughs from the audience, and that tells me all I need to know about you guys. Everything. All right, guys, but listen, it has been an absolute pleasure engaging with you guys. I'm so thankful for the audience's participation. I'm gonna ask you guys to just wrap up really quickly, give your final thoughts before we bring this session to an end. I'm gonna start with Marlon. And Joshua, can you bring the other mic from the audience, please?
All right, so my final thought is, in all of this that we're doing as activists, and I know most of us here on the panel, we enjoy our privileges, we enjoy in what we do, and some people may say, for example, I use myself as an example, most people ask me, as someone who is not part of the community, someone who is not a heterosexual person, why do you fight for these rights? And I often say to people, it is not about fighting. The very fact is, I see people as human beings. I see them as, if we go back to religion, and if we use the Bible tells us that we were all created in the image and likeness of God. I think if we're going to use that as a basis, that we were all created in the image and likeness of God, which means that every one of us ought to be treated equally. Every one of us are supposed to be given the same privilege. And so, for me, it is not about LGBT rights, it's not about women's rights, it's not about youth rights. It is just about human rights, our basic rights. These are rights that are given to us on the mere fact that we were born human beings. And that is how I see this issue. And that is how I wish people to see this issue. That people are not fighting for anything. People are just saying, give me what is due to me, which is respect, and treat me with dignity.
Zita?
I think
they might have.
Zita. Okay, there we go.
Thank you. I'm going to be very brief in my wrap-up, and Marlon has said a lot of things, and I think I can say that I adopt all that has been said here. I think as we have a really down-to-earth but intelligent, well-needed conversation, and I look forward for the day in St. Vincent and Grenadines that we become more tolerant, and that we'd understand, as all of us here have said before, that before us, each of us every day is another person called a human being, and we ought to love and respect that person and treat that person in the manner in which we'd like them to treat us, which is love and compassion.
Alisa?
So also want to say that I think that everything that has been said so far is incredibly important. And for people who are listening today who maybe are hearing some of this information for the first time, congratulations. I'm really happy that you tuned in. I hope that people are willing to have more conversations like this, because I think that that's what moves the ball forward. I'd introduced some language was introduced to me recently, and I just want to do the same thing here today. If you're somebody who's watching who already thinks of yourself as an ally, maybe even think of how you can go further than being an ally to being an accomplice. And what I mean by that is that you see the rights that are being demanded by persons who are LGBTQIA+ as being bound up in your own rights, because we are all, as Marlon said, human beings. Wherever an injustice is being done to somebody, it is in some way being done to you, or could be done to you. So maybe thinking, how do I want to advocate in my small circles of influence, to start that change happening in the smaller spaces that you have access to, whether that is a business, a civil society organization, in your own relationships, in the way you show up as a parent. I think that those are the tiny ways that we get these sorts of movements going from the grassroots.
All right, guys, so thank you guys so much. Again, I cannot say how much I enjoyed this conversation, just being able to hear what's happening, hear your thoughts, and also, more importantly, your solutions in really trying to lower the levels of violence and discrimination against LGBTQIA+ people in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. This was brought to you by Equal Rights, Access and Opportunities, SVG Inc., and sponsored by Pan American Health. I want to make sure I get that right. Pan American Development Fund. Let me make sure. Okay, because I do think the responsible thing to do is to ensure that the people who made this program possible are mentioned. If my phone would stop embarrassing me live on air, this would have gone very smoothly for at least 30 seconds ago, and I do apologize, but my phone is not cooperating. But of course, there are bodies here that offer themselves as a safe space, and Equal Rights, Access and Opportunities, SVG Inc. is one such community-based organization. I do encourage you to check out their social media, join, because again, while they do advocate for LGBTQIA+ people, they also advocate for youth, for women, for the disabled or differently abled, for people who are marginalized in general. Okay, and that might very well be someone you know and someone you love. So from all of us here today, my name is Tedra Kirby. Thank you so much for joining us.